Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time when your job was to copy the Bible by hand for 12 hours a day, in silence, in a cold stone room that smelled like melted tallow and old socks. Welcome to the medieval monastery, where every squeaky quill stroke echoes in candlelight, and the only thing wilder than your hairline is what you're secretly doodling in the margins. You're hunched over a creaking desk in the scriptorium. Your fingers are stained with ink, and your joints ache from holding the same cramped position since sunrise. Your job is noble, sacred, even preserving the Word of God for future generations. But you've just spent the past 2 hours copying the genealogy of someone, and your brain is threatening to melt like yesterday's butter. That's when you do it. You draw a hedgehog, right there in the margin, next to the verse about divine judgment. A small, round, spiny beast, eyes wide, holding a stick like a tiny woodland knight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge quietly into the scriptorium, your wool robe dragging slightly on the stone floor. It's chilly this morning, though. Morning is a generous term for what feels like night. The candles are already flickering in their wall sconces, and the only sound is the scratch of quills on parchment. Rows of your fellow monks sit slouched at their writing desks, some chewing on their lower lips, some blinking sleepily at their half-finished illuminations. You squeeze into your own seat, roll your shoulders, and glance at today's assignment, another chapter from Leviticus. Great. You dip your quill into the ink pot made of iron gall, by the way, and capable of eating straight through a page if you're not careful, and begin your meticulous work. Downstroke, hook, loop. You've done this for years, and you'll do it for years more. Monastic life doesn't offer much in the way of variety. Breakfast is porridge, silence is enforced, and your biggest social scandal last month was when Brother Oswald fell asleep during sext prayers and snored like a walrus. Now, technically, there are rules about what you can and can't do with sacred texts. The Bible, obviously, is supposed to remain free of, let's say, personal flair. But the margins, that's different. The margins are your canvas. The margins are where your personality gets to peek out from under all that spiritual obligation. So today, instead of copying that next verse about ritual purity, your eyes drift downward. You dip your pen in the darker ink, the one you save for embellishments. Then, ever so carefully, you sketch a hedgehog. Its body is a plump oval, its tiny feet just little ticks of ink. You give it enormous eyes, not realistic, but adorable and a slightly surprised expression. Around its back, you dab the spines in with a quick flick of the pen, and then, for fun, you draw it holding a turnip like a club. You glance around, but no one notices. Brother Cedric is still laboring over a diagram of the Ark of the Covenant, and Brother Gervais looks like he's trying to remember how to draw human feet. You're safe. The hedgehog is born. Here's the thing, you're not alone in this. Across monasteries in Europe, monks just like you are peppering their work with all kinds of oddities. Hedgehogs pop up in the margins of sacred texts, bestiaries, and even legal documents. And it's not just one or two isolated doodles. They're everywhere, rolling up grapes, fencing with sticks, sometimes just sitting there, looking vaguely guilty. Why hedgehogs? That's the million turnip question. Historians still argue whether the spiky little guys were meant to symbolize something: sin, defensiveness, the burdens of monastic life, or if they were just funny, relatable, endearing, even. You, sitting here after hours of copying about mildew-related sins, don't really care. You just know that drawing one made the time pass a little faster. And they were familiar too. You'd seen hedgehogs snuffling through the monastery garden, rooting around for beetles. They weren't exactly pets, but they weren't pests either. Kind of like the cats that wandered around the cloister's semi-welcome squatters who occasionally earned a name and a bit of leftover bread. Of course, not everyone was into it. There's always that one monk who thinks doodling a hedgehog next to the Book of Revelation is a one-way ticket to hellfire. But others, they got it. Some even took it further. You remember flipping through a manuscript from another scriptorium and finding a hedgehog on a wagon being pulled by frogs. It was glorious. Utterly meaningless. Probably. But glorious. One mainstream historical fact. Marginalia, those quirky drawings and decorations in medieval manuscripts, were often the only visual relief from the relentless uniformity of handwritten text. These embellishments weren't just decoration. They were a kind of medieval escape room for the imagination. Scribes worked under intense mental strain, and doodling in the margins gave them a much-needed outlet. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some monks not only drew hedgehogs, but wrote little poems to them, rhyming couplets in Latin about a hedgehog's spiny rear or its questionable table manners. That's what boredom will do to you. Of course. Hedgehogs weren't the only stars of the margins. You'll get to jousting snails and axe-wielding rabbits soon, but there's something uniquely sleepy and soft about imagining a hedgehog scuttling between candlelit desks while monks drone their chants in the background. So now, you pause. The hedgehog is complete. You return to the sacred text, to Leviticus and its endless stipulations about clean and unclean. But your mind lingers on your little creation, ink still drying in the flickering candlelight. Maybe it'll make someone smile 100 years from now. Maybe someone just like you, trying to stay awake during another bout of scriptural monotony, will look into those wide hedgehog eyes and feel just a little less alone. You blink slowly as the sun rises a little higher, outside the thick glass of the scriptorium windows, though to call that pale gray smear in the sky sun feels like flattery. You're barely halfway through your daily pages, and your fingers are already cramping again. Quill in hand, you dip it lightly into the ink and breathe, steady and slow. Every monk around you is hunched like a gargoyle, silently at war with boredom and muscle fatigue. It's the perfect setting for creative mischief. As your eyes flit from the Latin lines back down to your newest hedgehog, drawing this one, balancing on a leaf like it's surfing, you start to notice the margin space on your page has started to resemble a hedgehog's personal adventure log. And strangely, you don't feel guilty about it. In fact, it feels necessary. Because this job, it's an eternal loop of repetition. The hours stretch, the words blur, and when your thoughts begin to slip, these little drawings tether you to consciousness. You aren't being disobedient. You're surviving. Every day, monks like you are tasked with copying word for word, line by sacred line, using tools that are both ancient and delicate. Vellum processed animal skin is your paper, tough but slightly oily, often bearing faint hairlines or pockmarks from where the cow had a zit or a bug bite. It takes days to prepare even a single sheet, and you dare not mess it up. Your ink is handmade, prone to splotching if you're not careful, and your quill a goose feather carved down to a needle-fine tip, sharpened daily with a penknife that's barely sharper than your wit. So yes, everything is exacting, but that doesn't stop your hand from twitching, sometimes not out of rebellion, but simply out of being alive. You look again at the margin and consider adding a tree. Not a full tree. Of course that would be absurd, but maybe just a branch with a tiny owl in it, or perhaps a mouse poking out from behind a line of sacred genealogy. You've seen entire menageries grow like ivy along the edge of Scripture, and somehow it all feels like part of the process. Historians still argue whether monks were encouraged to decorate their manuscripts or simply tolerated for doing so. Some abbots actively praised illuminated works, especially when they were for wealthy patrons or important church texts. Others banned unnecessary embellishments, warning that too much ornamentation could lead the soul away from divine focus and toward frivolity. But again, the margins. The margins were a loophole. There's even a theory that marginalia wasn't just tolerated, it was strategically placed to keep scribes awake and engaged, like the medieval equivalent of doodling in your high school notebook during algebra. Only here, The notebook might take 3 years to finish and cost more than a small farm. And the content of these marginalia equal parts surreal, hilarious, and mildly concerning. Today, you spot a rabbit chasing a dog. Tomorrow, there might be a bishop playing chess with a snail. Your own hedgehog is evolving too. It now wears what looks suspiciously like a bishop's mitre. You didn't mean to give it one, but once the idea entered your head, the pen took over, and now, your hedgehog might be a religious authority. Good for him. Mainstream historians confirm that Marginalia wasn't all jokes and silliness. Many of the illustrations were allegorical, less ha-ha, and more think deeply about this. A monkey stealing fruit might represent sin. A knight fighting a snail might be a metaphor for an unwinnable spiritual battle. Or it could just be that the snail looked like Brother Edmund, and someone wanted to poke fun at his slow walking. Which brings us to a fringe tidbit. One of the weirder theories out there suggests that some monks were actually using marginalia as a form of passive protest, not against God, heaven forbid, but against the grinding monotony, the punishing silence, and maybe even specific habits. The theory goes that by drawing absurd or chaotic scenes, monks were venting frustrations in a way that couldn't technically be punished. Because what are you going to do, discipline someone for drawing a hedgehog who happens to be riding a pig? That's just creative license. Still, not every margin was a party. Some manuscripts are dry, sterile, and margin-free. Those probably belong to the more pious or more nervous scribes. Or maybe they just didn't have much imagination. You're starting to feel lucky that you're in the camp that sees hedgehogs and leaf surfers as fair game. There's even a whispered rumor about a monastery where the head scribe was so obsessed with perfection that he banned marginalia completely. The result? Half the monks fell asleep at their desks. One supposedly passed out onto a wet ink blot, leaving a perfect reverse of his nose on the manuscript. That particular page was never completed. It said you can still see the smudge today. And as you stare at your newest creation, a hedgehog now valiantly swinging a thistle, you're struck by how these silly little creatures feel like a journal. Not just yours, but a collective one. A quiet whisper from monk to monk across generations. We were here, the doodles say. We were tired. And this helped. The bell rings, snapping you out of your thoughts. Time for the midday meal, which is likely to be barley soup again. You place your quill carefully across the ink pot and stretch your arms, joints popping one by one like the click of a closing book. You glance once more at the hedgehog in the corner of your page. His tiny face seems just a little smug, like he knows he survived another round of copy duty, and he didn't even have to chant the Psalms. You nod to him and rise. You return to the scriptorium after your meager meal barley soup again, thin and beige like everything else in this life. The sun is higher now, diffused through stained glass and streaked across the stone floor in long, sleepy ribbons. You're full enough, warm enough, and dangerously close to nodding off, which means it's time to get back to work. You lower yourself into your seat, adjust your robe, and settle your hands around the quill again. The parchment in front of you glares softly, expectantly. You sigh. This is your life. This is what you've chosen. Monasticism. Baby. And here's the thing. No one tells you when you take the vow, monastic life is really boring. Oh sure, there's purpose and spiritual richness and all that. But mostly, it's an endless loop of routine. You rise in the middle of the night for matins. You pray. You eat. You copy. You pray again. You copy again. You eat again. You copy some more. Then you sleep. For a while. Until it starts all over. The calendar is filled with feast days. But don't get too excited. Those just mean slightly different prayers, and maybe an extra boiled egg. The days blur into each other, like a badly aligned manuscript. And it's in this haze of routine that your mind starts doing funny things. You begin to see stories in the curls of your letters, faces in the swirls of decorative capitals, and in the corners of your parchment, hedgehogs begin to roam. Why hedgehogs? Well, they're low to the ground, quiet, covered in bristles, kind of like monks. If you squint, they scurry around unnoticed, just like you, living simple lives full of unglamorous purpose. You get them. And when you draw one, it feels less like a joke and more like a weird sort of self-portrait. Your quill scratches out another hedgehog. This one is hauling a small cart full of turnips, and you give him a stoic expression. He's working hard, just like you. The parallel is obvious, even if you don't quite admit it to yourself. Historians still argue whether these hedgehog depictions were metaphorical or purely whimsical. Was the monk making a theological point? Was it satire? Was it merely the mental equivalent of a stretch break? The answer is probably yes to all of that. And boredom, you realize, is more powerful than people give it credit for. Boredom can lead to meditation. It can lead to madness. But more often, it leads to marginalia. Let's zoom in on your day a bit. The part most people would glaze over, but that you live in excruciating detail. After morning prayers and a silent breakfast, you spend hours copying. Your fingers get stiff. Your shoulders ache. Your knees complain from kneeling during lauds. You're not allowed to talk, but your brain is loud. It chatters. It rebels. And sometimes that rebellion comes out through your quill. It starts as a twitch, a flick of a line, a squiggle that turns into something else. Maybe a rabbit, maybe a fish, maybe a hedgehog with suspiciously human eyes. But the drawings grow bolder with each passing week. You're not even trying to hide them anymore. It's not like Brother Martin is going to rat you out. He just drew a donkey juggling apples in his book of hours last week. Your abbot might not approve, but he's also too nearsighted to catch the finer details, which is convenient, because today's hedgehog has developed a tail and is now riding a duck. Progress. You remember a story Brother Thomas told you once about a monk in another abbey who got reprimanded for drawing a naked man doing cartwheels in the margins of the Psalms. Supposedly, the abbot demanded to know the meaning of it. The monk answered, completely deadpan, "It is a metaphor for the turning of man's heart toward God." He wasn't punished. This is the kind of thing you think about when your only entertainment is copying Deuteronomy. A mainstream historical fact. Boredom wasn't just common in monastic life, it was considered a spiritual danger. There was even a Latin word for it, acedia. It meant a kind of listless despair, a spiritual weariness, the soul's version of writer's block. Monks wrote treatises about it, warning of its dangers. If you weren't careful, it could pull you into sinful thoughts, or, worse, apathy. Drawing hedgehogs in the margins. Probably not listed in the spiritual solutions. But maybe it should have been. Because here's a fringe tidbit, some monastic guidelines, like the rule of St. Benedict, advised regular manual labor and controlled reading schedules specifically to keep boredom at bay. They knew idleness was dangerous. But no matter how many times you sweep the cloister walk or scrub the fish buckets, you still have to come back here and stare at Latin verbs for 6 hours straight. So hedgehogs it is. You take comfort in the fact that some of the greatest illuminated manuscripts in history, like the Luttrell Psalter or the Gorliston Psalter, are filled with marginalia just as silly as yours. Their artists were monks too, probably just as sleepy, just as stiff, just as desperate for a laugh. Their hedgehogs might have been more detailed, their dragons a little fancier, but the feeling behind the ink is the same. And that's the strange thing about boredom. It's universal. It reaches across centuries, like a tired hand passing a note under the desk. You sit back for a moment, flexing your fingers. You've just finished a long paragraph about the ritual purification of lepers, and honestly, you're ready for a nap. But instead, you draw another hedgehog, this one curled up in a scroll, eyes shut, clearly asleep. You resist the urge to write same underneath it. Then, on a whim, you ink in a small loaf of bread beside him. Because even in your boredom, there's a strange kind of joy, a comfort in knowing that you're part of a long, quiet tradition where work meets whimsy, and hedgehogs carry the emotional load no saint ever could. The afternoon sun droops low now, stretching golden fingers through the scriptorium's narrow windows, making your parchment look warmer than it actually is. Outside, A breeze tickles the hedges of the cloister garden, and you catch a glimpse of Brother Elias hunched over a bush with suspicious intensity. He says he's gathering herbs for ointments, but last week you saw him trying to teach a squirrel to sit on his shoulder. Everyone copes differently. You return to your work. Another page, another line, another margin. Today's hedgehog is roasting a tiny fish over a campfire. You add a smudge of smoke, curling lazily upward toward the illuminated D that starts the psalm. The D is shaped like a lion with its tongue sticking out a flourish you included 3 weeks ago and immediately regretted. But now it's tradition. You stretch your back and glance around the room. Brother Matthew has a frog creeping up the side of his page. Brother Albin's gone full dramatic. His marginal knight is engaged in mortal combat with a goose. It's hard not to smile. Which brings you to an odd truth. Monasteries were strange, often unintentionally hilarious places. Monks lived by strict rules, rules about when to speak, when to fast, how to pray, how to walk, even how to think. But within all that structure, weirdness bloomed like mold on the cellar bread. You once overheard a novice ask, in all seriousness, whether it was sinful to enjoy the texture of porridge. And just last month, the brother in charge of the beehives tried to invent a monastic form of bee language. He still insists the bees hum the paternoster if you listen closely. This isn't just your monastery, either. Monastic weirdness is well documented. Mainstream history tells us that medieval monks were the intellectual engines of their time. They preserved ancient texts, advanced herbal medicine, and copied manuscripts with obsessive accuracy. But they were also deeply human. And humans, when locked in routines, tend to find cracks through which whimsy slips. Take the case of the abbot who banned onions because he was convinced they caused unholy dreams, or the monastery in France that had a chicken formally excommunicated after it laid an egg on the altar. You're not even sure how one excommunicates poultry, but apparently it involves chanting in Latin and throwing a feather into the river. And let's not forget the fringe theories, the ones whispered by monks when the abbot's out of earshot. Some say the Marginalia animals come alive at night, roaming through the texts like tiny pilgrims on a spiritual scavenger hunt. Others swear that if you draw a hedgehog on every page of the Psalms, your pen hand will never cramp again. No one's proven it, but no one's disproved it either. Historians still argue whether these rumors were metaphorical, devotional, or just sleep-deprived hallucinations. Personally, you think a little of each. You once woke up from a nap in the cloister, convinced that your inkwell had whispered to you. You haven't told anyone. Yet. But back to hedgehogs. They've become something of a mascot now, a quiet rebellion against monotony. Your current one is fishing from the back of a snail naturally, because snails are Marginalia royalty. They show up everywhere dueling knights, kissing bishops, inexplicably muscular legs sticking out of shells. No one knows why snails were such a hit. Maybe it's the irony, tiny, slow, ridiculous. Maybe monks just like the way their shells spiraled like the illuminated capitals they labored over. There's a theory that the snail represents the devil, or cowardice, or France. Historians can't agree. And really, would it ruin the joke if we knew for sure? You pause to admire your handiwork. This new hedgehog looks pleased with himself. He's caught a fish the size of his body, and his face beams with triumph. You start to add a tiny mug of ale beside him. But stop. That's excessive. You're not a heretic. Besides, the bell is about to ring for none the mid-afternoon prayer, and you need to finish your passage. You hurry through the last few lines, trying to balance reverence with speed. Your fingers move instinctively now, gliding through the loops and slashes of the script, but your mind is far away. You're thinking about that old story Brother Gideon once told, the one about the hedgehog who became a saint. It's obviously nonsense, but charming nonsense. According to the tale, a hedgehog once saved a village from starvation by leading the monks to a hidden field of turnips. The monks, grateful, declared the creature holy. For years afterward, they drew his likeness in the margins of every text, adding a halo and occasionally a miniature habit. He was dubbed Saint Quilbert, patron of sleepy scribes and garden roots. It's not an official saint, of course. But neither is half the stuff that survives in these pages. And that's the magic of Marginalia. It preserves, not just scripture, but the unspoken story beneath it, the snort laughs, the inside jokes, the secret companions you conjure to get through the 50th repetition of et in secula seculorum. You dip your quill once more, adding a final detail. Your hedgehog has now been joined by a friend, a slightly squashed-looking ferret with a flower crown. They're roasting the fish together, and you're not sure what it means, but it feels right. There's always been a quiet brotherhood among the marginal animals. They rarely appear alone, and maybe, just maybe, they represent what you're all doing here, working together in a quiet, strange, sacred mess, sharing stories that don't need approval, smiling when no one's watching. The bell rings. You close the ink, cap your quill, and stretch. Your knees crack like thunder in a chapel, but you're too tired to care. Outside, the breeze carries the smell of rosemary and damp earth. Time to pray. Time to keep going. Time for more pages, more margins, and more hedgehogs, because if you're going to spend your life copying the same words again and again, you might as well do it in the company of small, spiky friends. The sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the cloister walk and turning the stone walls the color of toasted oats. You shuffle out of the scriptorium in a line of sleepy monks, your joints stiff from sitting and your fingertips faintly smudged with ink. The bell for none has rung, and it's time to trade parchment for prayer. You pass through the garden, inhaling the earthy scent of damp herbs and moss. Somewhere nearby, Brother Elias hums tunelessly as he plucks mint leaves with what can only be described as aggressive reverence. You try not to make eye contact. As you enter the chapel, you dip your fingers into the holy water basin and cross yourself. The air inside is cool and still. Like a held breath, you settle into your place, and the chants begin not from your lips, not yet, but from the older brothers with voices like worn velvet. You close your eyes. You let the Latin flow over you like a warm tide, and for a moment you forget the hedgehogs. But only for a moment, because your mind, ever rebellious, conjures a mental image of a hedgehog in a choir robe, holding a tiny hymnal. You suppress a snort, disguising it as a cough. Across the aisle, Brother Matthew raises a single eyebrow. He knows. You manage to finish the service without bursting into giggles. Barely. Then, it's back out into the cooling air, and eventually, blessedly, back to the scriptorium. There are still pages to finish, still psalms to copy, and still margins waiting to be filled with nonsense. You're starting to think the hedgehogs might be evolving. Today, one of them is holding a banner that reads Fiat Spina, let there be quills. It's not theologically sound, but it is hilarious. You can't wait to show Brother Alban. It makes you wonder, though, how far back does this nonsense go? When did monks start doodling in margins? Were the early church fathers secretly slipping in snails and juggling bears while copying the Vulgate? Turns out, Marginalia has roots that run deep. Mainstream historians trace the tradition as far back as the early medieval period, especially from the 9th century onward. That's when illuminated manuscripts really started becoming works of art. In places like Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England, monastic scriptoria flourished, producing gloriously decorated Bibles, psalters, and books of hours. The margins were supposed to house simple decorations, floral borders, small animals, occasional saints. But somewhere along the line, those animals started behaving strangely. They danced, they fought, they wore trousers, and no one said stop. That's the thing, Marginalia was never officially sanctioned, but it also wasn't explicitly forbidden. The church never released a papal bull declaring ye shall not draw hedgehogs, roasting tiny fish. So monks filled the silence with whimsy, with mischief, with hedgehogs. Fringe historians, those delightfully strange folks who spend more time with the margins than the text, have long debated the meaning of these oddities. Some see them as coded critiques of church power. Others suggest they were mnemonic devices, or visual prayers, or just the medieval equivalent of doodling in the margins of your math homework. Historians still argue whether Marginalia served a devotional purpose or a deeply human one. Maybe it's both. Maybe you draw a hedgehog because you're bored, and then later realize it looks a lot like St. Cuthbert if you squint and give it a staff. You pull your focus back to the page in front of you. The text is from Psalm 91, a favorite. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. You feel that shadow now, stretching softly over you, wrapping the room in gentle quiet. You pause before continuing, not because you're tired, although you are, but because something in the verse tugs at you. Secret places, shelter, hiddenness. You glance at your latest hedgehog, a sleepy-looking fellow curled beneath a leaf, nose twitching. Maybe that's what the hedgehogs represent, in the end. Safety, retreat, a tiny echo of your own quiet existence, tucked away in the folds of the world, unnoticed by most, meaningful to few, but stubbornly alive all the same. You think of the Book of Kells, that dazzling Irish manuscript so full of knots and curls and otherworldly beasts. You think of the Gorliston Psalter, where hybrid creatures cavort and knights duel with snails. And you think of your own little scribbles, not nearly as grand, but part of the same strange lineage. Your hands ache, but you smile. Somewhere, centuries from now, some historian with poor eyesight and a very strong magnifying glass might squint at your hedgehogs and wonder who you were, what you thought about, why you drew them. You like the idea that your boredom might someday become someone else's curiosity. You add another flourish, a tiny mushroom beside the hedgehog. He's got a picnic going now. It's becoming a scene. And then, for no reason at all, you draw a second hedgehog peeking out from behind the capital letter B. He's got a slightly guilty look, like he just borrowed a book without asking. You decide his name is Rufus. Rufus joins Quilbert, your original hedgehog hero. The gang's growing. You stretch again, letting your joints pop like a badly tuned organ. Outside, dusk is curling around the monastery like a shawl. Soon, the bell for Vespers will toll. And then there will be one last meal, one last prayer, and precious sleep before it starts all over again. But for now, you press on. The candlelight flickers, the margins fill, the hedgehogs roam free, as they always have, unnoticed by history's grand stage, but quietly carving out a corner of it nonetheless. And tomorrow, who knows, maybe they'll start a band. You shuffle back into the refectory, your stomach growling like a penitent lion who's given up meat for Lent. The evening meal is simple vegetable broth, a crust of bread, maybe some soft cheese if Brother Simon didn't squirrel it away again. As always, you eat in silence, listening to the droning voice of the reader at the lectern as he recites another homily. His cadence is so predictable that you find yourself mouthing the words along with him, like a Gregorian karaoke track. Between sips of watery stew, your thoughts drift back, of course, to hedgehogs. Specifically, to that moment 2 months ago when you spotted a real one outside the cloister wall, rooting around in the herb patch, small, round, unconcerned by your gaze. He blinked at you like a disapproving librarian, then waddled off into a patch of time. That was the day you drew your first hedgehog in a manuscript margin, and you haven't stopped since. The truth is, the real animals were part of monastic life more than most people think. Sure, monks were celibate, cloistered, and very much committed to a life of sacrifice, but they weren't heartless. Many of them, especially in rural monasteries, lived alongside animals in various ways. Cats to keep the mice away from the grain, bees for wax and honey, chickens for eggs, and occasionally, the odd little creature who didn't serve a purpose, except to make life a little more bearable. Mainstream records mention monastery pets more often than you'd expect. One French abbot wrote fondly of a fox who would nap on the warm stones behind the apse. A 12th century monk named Aelred was said to keep a lamb that followed him everywhere. And in one delightfully bizarre English account, a novice was reprimanded for trying to baptize a dormouse. Historians still argue whether these animals were officially allowed or just tolerated, But clearly, some monastic communities formed quiet attachments. Maybe it's not surprising. You're lonely a lot in here. A silent order doesn't lend itself to friendly banter. So when a hedgehog waddles into the cloister garden like he owns the place, you don't chase him off. You watch him. You name him. You draw him in the margins of sacred texts. Not all animals were welcomed equally, though. Dogs were sometimes frowned upon, too boisterous. Pigs, while common in peasant households, were considered unclean in the symbolic sense. But hedgehogs, quiet, solitary, inoffensive, and covered in prickles, like divine penance in mammal form. There's something fitting about them in a monastic context. They roll up when frightened, just as you retreat into your prayers. They move slowly, deliberately, as monks do in procession. They're nocturnal, which would be less useful for you, but spiritually relevant, considering how many night vigils you've endured while fighting off sleep. And yes, you know the popular medieval belief that hedgehogs stole grapes by rolling through vineyards and impaling fruit on their quills. It's nonsense, obviously, but that didn't stop monks from including the image in Marginalia and sermons. Fringe sermons? Sure, the kind rarely quoted in formal theology. But still, the hedgehog became a symbol, a reminder to gather good works quietly and carry them with you, even if you looked ridiculous doing it. You once heard a visiting friar say, "Be like the hedgehog, small and humble, yet armed against temptation." You're not sure it's canon, but it sounds right. You finish your bread, which is only slightly staler than the table it's served on, and take one last spoonful of broth. Across the refectory, Brother Alban seems deep in thought. You know that look. He's planning his next Marginalia prank. Last time, he hid a badger riding a fish in the middle of a genealogy page. No one noticed for 2 weeks. Outside, the stars begin to pepper the sky, and a hush settles over the cloister like fresh snow. The air is sharp now, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and crushed sage. You slip away before Compline, making a brief detour around the herb patch, just in case your hedgehog returns. He doesn't, but the thyme rustles suspiciously. You pretend not to see it. Let him have his privacy. Back in the scriptorium, the candlelight feels warmer. You pick up your quill again, careful not to smear the still drying ink from earlier. The passage now is from the book of Job, dense, solemn, aching with divine drama. You resist the urge to sneak in a hedgehog in mourning robes. Instead, you keep it subtle, a small one, tucked behind the final period of the chapter, just barely visible unless you squint. He's holding a flower. You don't know why. It just felt right. There's something cathartic about it. A secret joke shared across time. An invisible handshake between you and future readers. Or maybe just a way to make sense of a life where your days are measured in psalms and your nights in candle stubs. Fringe theory of the day, some say the more animals you draw, the less likely you are to be reborn as one. It's obviously heretical. But Brother Matthew insists it's based on a mistranslation of Assyrian text and has drawn over 400 frogs in the margins of Ecclesiastes. Historians still argue whether these marginal doodles were theological commentary, psychological release, or just boredom gone feral. You suspect a mix of all three, but you also believe this a hedgehog in the margin is worth a sermon in the pulpit. It speaks. It reminds you that you are still, against all odds, alive, that in the spaces where you are not being watched, you can still leave something of yourself behind. You lean back, brush a few breadcrumbs from your lap, and survey the page. The work is slow. The work is endless. But it's yours. Outside, the wind stirs the thyme again. You could swear you hear a faint sneeze. The night deepens, and with it comes the kind of quiet that isn't really quiet at all. You hear the creak of ancient wood in the beams overhead, the whisper of wind slipping through cracks in the stone, the distant hoot of an owl, who clearly didn't take a vow of silence. Even the flames in the scriptorium lanterns crackle with a rhythm that feels almost conspiratorial. You're supposed to be asleep by now, but you aren't. Not quite. Your candle flickers. You hold your hand out and rotate your wrist slowly, watching the play of shadow between your fingers. You are, in this moment, entirely alone, but not in a lonely way. There's something comforting about this hour, like you're borrowing time from the day, and the monastery won't notice if you slip it back before dawn. You're not working anymore. Not really. The quill is resting, but the manuscript lies open in front of you, waiting, and the margins, wide and pale and tempting, call to you. You remember the hedgehog you drew earlier, Rufus, hiding behind a capital B? He deserves a friend, doesn't he? Someone to chat with while you're off copying genealogy charts that make your eyes blur. You dip the quill in ink again. Just a quick sketch. This one is rounder, slightly smug, holding a scroll. Congratulations, you've just given birth to your third hedgehog. You don't name him yet. He's mysterious, possibly a scholar, possibly a wizard, possibly both. But he's there now, and you feel better knowing it. And here's where things get interesting. It's not just you doing this. Marginalia, especially animal marginalia, is everywhere in the monastic manuscripts of Europe. Hedgehogs, yes, but also monkeys playing the bagpipes, rabbits jousting on snails, and birds wearing what appear to be tiny hats. These weren't one-off jokes. This was practically a subculture. Mainstream scholars believe these images weren't just whimsical, they may have functioned as social commentary. Consider the snail-riding knights. Some think they mocked cowardice among the nobility. Others think they were just absurd for absurdity's sake, like a medieval version of internet memes. And hedgehogs, well, those could be anything from an emblem of humility to just a tribute to a funny little beast monks liked having around. Historians still argue whether these creatures were satire, symbolic warnings, or just the results of too much fermented mead on an empty stomach. You lean closer to your work, recalling a fragment you overheard from a visiting scholar who came from Paris last winter. He claimed some monastic artists, especially those trained in the Gothic period, took pride in sneaking small, subversive imagery into the pages, confident the ecclesiastical higher-ups would never notice. It's not hard to believe. After all, who's really reading the margins of a Latin homily on the dangers of envy? You squint at the page. The mysterious hedgehog is looking more like a librarian now, which you don't mind. You give him a pair of tiny spectacles, precariously balanced on his snout. No one will notice unless they're looking for it. And there's a thrill in that. Isn't there a kind of quiet rebellion? Your life is structured to the point of absurdity bells. Prayers, meals, work, more prayers. You don't get to decide much. But in the margins, you're the master of a world. A tiny, quilled world. You get to say when the hedgehog goes to war, and when he naps under a mushroom. Even more curious, these drawings didn't exist in isolation. In some manuscripts, you'll see a full-on narrative playing out across multiple pages, almost like medieval comics. A fox hunting a chicken on one folio, the chicken turning the tables on the next, a procession of bears carrying candles, a monkey stealing a monk's tonsure, and yes, a hedgehog being crowned king by a court of mice. Fringe researchers have suggested this might be a form of storyboarding monks passing time by telling stories only they could decipher, like visual gossip, unfolding in secret across sacred texts. You imagine a circle of brothers, heads bowed over illuminated letters, trying to contain their laughter as Brother Gerard reveals the next twist in his hedgehog saga. Ah, but on this page, he builds a catapult from a spoon, and a piece of straw gasps all around. Scandalous. It makes you wonder, are your hedgehogs part of a tradition, older and more widespread than you ever realized? Maybe every monastery had one monk who couldn't resist adding a bit of personality to the psalms. You glance up at the shelves, row upon row of carefully stored manuscripts, some of them older than anyone alive, some barely finished. Who knows how many secret doodles live in those pages? The scholarly hedgehog now has a footnote beside him. You don't even know what it says. It's in fake Latin. A crime against language, yes. But it makes you smile. Outside, the wind is picked up. A shutter rattles against the wall. Somewhere far off, a dog howls, and you briefly consider adding a tiny one under the hedgehog's desk, curled up with a bone. Your ink is drying too fast in the chill air. You warm your fingers over the candle. Another thought creeps in. What if someone centuries from now sees this? What if a bored grad student, buried under student loans and thesis deadlines, opens this manuscript in a sterile library and stumbles upon Rufus and his footnoted friend? Will they laugh? Will they understand? Maybe not. Maybe they'll be too focused on the main text, too reverent to acknowledge the silliness and the shadows. But maybe, just maybe, they'll smile. Maybe they'll add a note in the catalog. Contains curious marginalia. Possible hedgehog parliament. You like that idea. The night is heavy now. The candle's low. Your eyes are starting to sting. You close the manuscript gently, as if tucking it in for sleep. The hedgehogs are safe inside. Let them rest. You rise from your seat, stretch once, and shuffle toward the dormitory. As you pass through the cloister, the wind touzles your hair. You swear you hear rustling in the time again. You don't check. Let him have his secrets. The morning bell rings far too soon, its cold clang slicing through your dreams like a monk slicing bread with a judgmental frown. You groan inwardly, resisting the urge to burrow deeper into the thin wool blanket. But rules are rules, and sloth, as you are frequently reminded, is a cardinal sin. So you sit up, blink blearily into the half-dark, and begin your day again, one ritual at a time. You pad across the stone floor in bare feet, your toes curling against the cold. Outside, a pale sun yawns over the horizon, casting long shadows across the cloister. Another day of prayers, work, and somewhere in between, possibly a hedgehog riding a donkey in the book of Leviticus. You pass Brother Peter in the hallway. He nods. A silent greeting. You know he's hiding a hedgehog too. His sits triumphantly atop a fallen Saracen on a battle manuscript, wearing what appears to be a crown and clutching a thimble. Brother Peter pretends to be pious, but you've seen his marginalia. There's no going back once you've drawn a hedgehog in regal attire. Back in the scriptorium, you resume your task. Today it's a bestiary, a medieval animal encyclopedia of sorts. These books are delightfully bonkers, full of beasts both real and imaginary. Lions who erase their tracks to avoid hunters, elephants with no knees, beavers who bite off their own testicles to escape poachers. That one is oddly persistent across texts, and no, you don't draw that. Hedgehogs, though, are almost always there. According to the bestiary, the hedgehog is a cunning creature. It climbs grapevines, not true. Rolls over the fallen fruit, so the grapes stick to its spines, also not true, and brings them home to its young. The moral: provide for your family, even if you have to be a little sticky about it. You can't help but love that image. A humble hedgehog, trudging home with its cargo of grapes like a spiky delivery boy. Is it heroic? Absurd both. Mainstream scholars now see bestiaries as didactic tools, moral instruction through animal allegory. Every beast had a lesson. The lion represented Christ, the unicorn purity, the pelican, oddly, was thought to peck its own chest to feed its young with blood, a rather on-the-nose metaphor for sacrifice. But the hedgehog was just scrappy, modest, surprisingly competent. Historians still argue whether the hedgehog's role was truly symbolic or just a fun excuse to throw a weird-looking animal into the moral mix. Some say its presence in bestiaries is evidence of a broader affection among monks for the animal. Others argue it was just a space filler with spines. You flip a few pages ahead. There it is again. A hedgehog clambering up a vine with the desperation of a monk trying to stay awake during the 7th hour of prayer. This one has what looks like a satchel, as if he's turned grape collecting into a full-fledged business. You take a moment to embellish the scene. Add a tiny monocle. Give him a name in your head: Sir Percival of Pinot, the noblest hedgehog vintner in all the cloister lands. A fringe interpretation from a rather eccentric abbey in southern Germany insists that hedgehogs symbolize monks themselves withdrawn, quiet, covered in metaphorical quills of wisdom. It's a stretch, but it also fits better than most saints' lives. As you continue copying the text, You think about how these animal tales offered monks something more than moral guidance. They were entertainment, little stories folded into the grander narratives of faith and nature. After all, when your life revolves around the repetition of ritual, a pelican bleeding on its children becomes the medieval version of binge-worthy content. Somewhere near the back of the manuscript, there's a hybrid creature you half suspect started as a hedgehog and ended as a dragon. These things happen when your ink is low and you've gone too long without bread. You pause for a moment, stretching your back, and glance out the scriptorium window. The courtyard below is quiet, save for Brother Ethelred, who's clearly chasing something under a bush. You can't hear him, but the exaggerated tiptoe stance and the way his robe hitches suggest hedgehog shenanigans. Again, you smile. You know that bush. The time patch. The one where your own spiny muse makes his evening appearances. And you know, though you'll never prove it, that this is the same hedgehog making the rounds from cloister to cloister, leaving a trail of sleepy smiles and ink-stained sketches in his wake. You wonder if he has a name. Not the one you gave him, Rufus, but his real name. The name hedgehogs whisper to each other while rustling under basil leaves. Maybe it's Harold, or maybe it's something unpronounceable in human tongues, a name made entirely of sniffs and sneezes. Either way, he's earned his place in the margins. You return to your work. The quill scratches softly, the ink smooth as honey. You draw another hedgehog. This one's trying to read a scroll that's far too large for him. His little paws can't hold it steady. You give him a stack of pebbles to prop it up. He looks proud, or confused. It's hard to tell with hedgehogs. Another hour passes. Another psalm. Another prayer whispered under your breath. The candle burns lower. You've stopped checking how much you've copied. You're not rushing anymore. You're savoring. And then, without warning, Brother Matthew leans over your shoulder and murmurs, "That hedgehog looks like Prior Richard." You startle, nearly smudging the page. "What? No, it doesn't." "Oh, it does," he says, eyes twinkling. See the eyebrows. You look. He's not wrong. "Well, you say dryly, it's a generic hedgehog. Could be anyone." Matthew shrugs. "If the prior sees it, I'll deny everything." You both chuckle, then fall silent. That's about as much rebellion as you're allowed before breakfast. The bell rings again. Time to shelve the fun. But as you close the bestiary, you can't help but glance at your final edition. A hedgehog, blurry at the edges from slightly damp ink, pulling a cart full of grapes. His eyes are determined. His tail, for once, visible. You've added a sign hanging from the cart that says, "Divine Deliveries." No one else will see it for decades, maybe centuries, but you will. And it's enough. You're not supposed to be in the garden after dark. The cloister rules are clear about that, particularly during Lent, when the hours are carefully rationed between prayer, fasting, and work. But tonight, you feel drawn by something else. Not quite rebellion. More like curiosity laced with moss and moonlight. You slip out quietly after Compline, feet crunching lightly on the gravel path. The moon hangs low and buttery, casting long silver shadows across the herb beds. Somewhere near the apothecary, an owl blinks and considers you unworthy of comment. You pass under the stone arch and step into the herbarium. The scent is immediate time. Sage, lavender, damp soil, familiar and comforting, like an old friend's coat. And then, from the corner, a rustle. Low. Quick. You freeze. You hear it again, this time closer. You crouch beside the rosemary. And sure enough, there he is, your nocturnal muse, the hedgehog. He doesn't acknowledge you, of course. He's busy, snuffling at the base of a fennel stalk, with the single-minded focus of someone who's absolutely sure there's a worm underneath. You watch for a long moment, resisting the urge to say something absurd like, "Thank you for the inspiration." Instead, you simply observe. His spines catch the moonlight like tiny silver needles. His body is round, low to the earth. He is the very image of self-sufficiency, and you realize something you hadn't thought about before. This little animal doesn't belong in your manuscript because he's funny. He belongs because he fits. He belongs because the monastery, for all its grand stone and solemn chants, is still part of the natural world. It just forgets sometimes. Monks live structured lives hour by hour, prayer by prayer, but the hedgehog lives by seasons. He knows when to hibernate, when to forage, when to vanish. He has no clock, no bell tower, no rules, and somehow, in his quiet, snuffling way, he keeps pace with everything. Mainstream historians agree that monasteries were, despite appearances, deeply embedded in the natural world. The idea of monastic seclusion wasn't about rejecting nature, it was about harmonizing with it. Many monks tended to gardens, raised bees, tracked the stars, and yes, watched animals. Hedgehogs, according to several fringe monastic journals, were sometimes treated as unofficial residents. Not pets in the modern sense. You didn't give them names or teach them tricks, but respected presences, like hermits within a hermitage. There are even records of monks gently relocating them from one garden bed to another, muttering things like, "Go on now. The basil needs a rest," as if the creature could comprehend crop rotation. Some scholars suggest that this passive companionship was a kind of spiritual mirror. Hedgehogs were solitary, unobtrusive, and nocturnal, an echo of monastic life, but stripped of doctrine, pure behavior. Historians still argue whether these little animals were truly welcomed or simply tolerated. After all, they occasionally got into the food stores. One Benedictine record from 1231 laments the theft of several precious gooseberries, likely thieved by a prickled fiend. Sounds harsh. But 3 pages later, the same monk includes a doodle of a hedgehog reclining beside a goblet. So, mixed feelings. You inch closer, your hedgehog Rufus Harold finally notices you. He pauses, gives you a long, pointed sniff, and then waddles off toward the blackberry hedge like you've bored him. Fair enough. You don't follow. Instead, you sit on the low garden wall and let the night air settle around you. The truth is, this monastery isn't as rigid as it pretends. There's a rhythm here, a quiet acceptance that nature, ink, prayer, and whimsy all belong. You think of all the Marginalia rabbits armed with swords, foxes giving sermons, fish playing lutes. They don't clash with the scriptures. They live beside them, complement them, like spice to stew. And the hedgehog, with his shy wisdom and slow persistence, might be the perfect symbol of that harmony. Tomorrow, you'll go back to the scriptorium. You'll copy the same lines, bow your head at the same bells. But you'll also add a tiny, dignified hedgehog, reading a map, possibly leading a caravan of field mice through hostile theological terrain. You consider going back to bed, but instead, you walk one more loop around the garden. There's something magical about seeing it this way, barefoot, moonlit, gently alive. You catch sight of a snail gliding across a cabbage leaf and half expect it to be jousting. As you make your way back through the cloister, the night is quiet again. No bells, no footsteps, just the low hum of your own thoughts. You pause at the threshold to the dormitory, then double back to the scriptorium. You need to add one last thing before sleep. You open your manuscript, flip to the inside of the back cover, and draw the tiniest hedgehog yet. Just an outline. Really? Curled into a ball beside a scroll labeled Secrets. It's not a joke. It's not a moral. It's just him, watching over the book like a guardian of ink. You close the manuscript softly, as if not to wake him. Then, finally, you go to bed. You wake to bells again. You always do. The same low bronze call rolling through the stone halls, stirring the air like a chant without words. You blink the sleep from your eyes, stretch, and feel the stiffness of another night spent dreaming about parchment and ink and possibly a hedgehog in bishop's robes. The dormitory is already emptying, monks rising like clockwork. You join them in the slow shuffle toward morning prayer, robes swishing softly in the cold air. Outside, the sky is thick with fog. The cloister walks vanish into the white like secrets halfway confessed. You know what the day holds hours of copying, chanting, maybe weeding the turnip bed if Brother Cedric is feeling especially cruel. But your mind is already back in the margins. Because yesterday, before dinner, You stumbled upon a different kind of manuscript. It was hidden in the bottom of the old cabinet in the scriptorium beneath a pile of worn psalters and unfinished genealogies. Its cover was plain, just a cracked bit of calfskin, no title. But inside was a different world entirely. Not scripture, not even bestiary. It was weird. There were pages full of drawings, not full-page illuminations, but stacked scenes like a medieval storyboard. Some made sense: lions battling boars, monks walking through cities. Others were absurd: a man serenading a snail with a lute, an owl on trial, a hedgehog sailing a walnut shell. And in nearly every scene, there he was, the same little hedgehog. Not the exact same drawing, but clearly the same character. A tiny, spiny hero navigating a world that didn't notice him, or underestimated him, or simply didn't care. One page showed him negotiating with a fox king. Another had him climbing a ladder that reached to a star labeled Saint Commentarius. The best one showed him roasting a chestnut over a fire made entirely of halos. There was no clear narrative, no explanation, just a quiet thread running through the chaos. You brought it up with Brother Bernard, who only raised an eyebrow and muttered, "Ah, yes, the little pilgrim," as if that explained anything. Historians still argue whether marginalia like this was the work of individual monks entertaining themselves, or whether there were shared characters passed down like folklore, sort of a medieval version of an inside joke turned mythos. The idea that several monks across generations might have kept drawing the same spiny wanderer, not impossible, just unprovable. Still, there he was, page after page, the little pilgrim. Mainstream scholarship tends to treat these recurring figures as whimsy, with little theological purpose. But a newer school of thought suggests something more: an emotional undercurrent. In a world defined by ritual, repetition, and submission, perhaps these tiny travelers were spiritual avatars, pilgrims of the margin, exploring the unwritten edges of belief. And isn't that what you feel like some days? Not a scholar, not a saint, just someone making their way through the fog, one page at a time. You think about that as you settle into your place at the long scriptorium table. You open your own manuscript again, quill in hand, and glance at the margin where you left off. There's a blank space there, right beside the genealogy of King Oswald. You hesitate, then draw a hedgehog peeking around the edge of the page, eyes wide. In one paw, he holds a scroll. In the other, a small sword made of what appears to be a carrot. He's not fighting anyone, just watching, waiting. You hear someone clearing their throat behind you and freeze, thinking you've been caught. But it's Brother Anselm. He leans over your shoulder, squints, and says, he looks anxious. You glance at the hedgehog. He's about to tell a truth no one wants to hear. Anselm nods slowly. Ah, like Prior Richard's sermon on celery fasting. You stifle a laugh. Anselm smiles faintly and returns to his seat. That's the thing about this place. The rules are strict. The routines are relentless. But there's still room to breathe between the lines. Still space for a carrot sword hedgehog facing a crisis of honesty. The fog outside thickens. You can see it curling at the edges of the window like a ghost trying to peek in. It makes the world feel smaller, quieter. Inside, the only sounds are quills scratching, pages turning, the occasional sigh as a monk smudges a line and must start again. You draw another hedgehog, this one curled asleep inside a chalice. The chalice is balanced on a cat's back. The cat looks confused. You don't know why, but it feels true. Later, during the midday meal, the topic comes up again. Someone's found another hedgehog in the psalter of Brother Reginald. This one is dancing. With a chicken. You don't ask questions. You simply raise your spoon in silent salute. Fringe historians sometimes joke that if you traced all the marginalia hedgehogs across monastic Europe, you'd map the contours of monkly boredom. But boredom is too simple a word. It's something else. A quiet rebellion. A soft refusal to let the page be only what it's told to be. You finish your soup, return your bowl, and head back to your station. Outside, the fog lingers. Inside, your ink dries, and the margins call. not for perfection, but for something small, round, and surprisingly brave. The sun finally decides to show itself, barely nudging through the cloud cover like it's checking to see if it's worth the trouble. You step out into the cloister walk between prayers, arms stretched, breath fogging in the cool air, stone underfoot, damp and mossy. The kind of morning where the world feels wrapped in wool soft, muted, with nothing too sharp to wake you too quickly. And there, nestled by the base of a column, is a lump of bristling brown. Another hedgehog. Or maybe the same one? Honestly, you're starting to suspect there's only one hedgehog, and he's secretly teleporting around the monastery to maintain his legend, like a spiny little trickster god. This one's half asleep, nose twitching, eyes barely open. You don't disturb him. You just sit nearby, letting the cold stone steal the warmth from your robes. You rest your chin on your knees and try to imagine life from his perspective. No hierarchy, no calligraphy, no endless debates over which saint allegedly sneezed fire. Yes, that came up last week. Just ground-level knowledge where the worms are, how to curl up safely, when to hide, when to wander. Historians still argue whether hedgehogs were respected or simply endured in medieval monastic life. The evidence, like the creatures themselves, is scattered and elusive. There's the record from a Cistercian cloister in Flanders noting a need to clear the cloister walks of hedgehog droppings, which suggests a decent population. But elsewhere, references are tender. A marginal note in a Scottish psalter calls one our little prickle monk. Mainstream scholars agree on one thing: hedgehogs were deeply embedded in the ecosystem of monastic gardens. They ate slugs and beetles that would have ravaged the herb beds. They worked for their keep quietly, diligently, like furry monks without vestments. It makes sense, then, that they earned their way into the pages. Back in the scriptorium, someone's left out a collection of letters. Not grand papal stuff, just local correspondence between monasteries. You flip through them while waiting for the ink to dry on your latest psalm. One letter from a Welsh monk includes the line, "Brother Owain says the hedgehog reappeared by the apothecary garden. He has not spoken since Lent began, and we suspect he is holier than most of us." You laugh aloud. Brother Owain or the hedgehog. Maybe both. You think about how language works here. Everything is layered with meaning. Saints are symbol-laden. Herbs have hidden virtues. Animals are rarely just animals. And yet, hedgehogs seem to resist symbolism. They are literal creatures in a world of metaphors. That might be their appeal. Take the unicorn. For example, pure, divine, allegorical. A hedgehog, by contrast, is undeniably earthy. He's not guiding virgins to spiritual ecstasy. He's eating a beetle under a gooseberry bush. He's real. And maybe that's what makes him so valuable in the margins. He grounds the page, reminds the reader this is still a world with worms. You return to your seat and glance at the scroll you're copying. It's about penitence-heavy stuff, full of fire and judgment. But at the bottom, in a tiny flourish of rebellion, someone has drawn a hedgehog sitting in a confessional. The priest is a goose. The hedgehog looks guilty. You chuckle. Then you add a second hedgehog just outside the booth, holding a sign that says, "Next." You wonder if any of these drawings ever got someone into trouble. Historians aren't sure. Marginalia was usually tolerated, sometimes even celebrated. But there are cases where monks were reprimanded for unsanctioned decoration. One German record from the 14th century refers to a brother Lucas, whose margins strayed into theological farce. Harsh words, especially when you find the surviving manuscript and discover that Lucas's farce was a frog baptizing a hedgehog using a flower as a sprinkler. Deeply offensive, apparently, but for every Lucas, there were a dozen anonymous monks filling the quiet corners of faith with silent laughter. Little jests, not to mock doctrine, but to survive it. You start to see it now, not just as art, but as conversation. Hedgehog Marginalia wasn't random. It was a slow-motion dialogue between monks who never met, speaking in drawings instead of words. Your hedgehog joins them, You've drawn him now in 6 different places. Once holding a candlestick, once being chased by a bee the size of a watermelon, and once, nobly, curled inside a knight's helmet with a banner that reads, "Not today." He's taking on a life of his own, a story told sideways. You're not alone. Around the room, the trend has caught fire. Brother Cedric just added one wearing glasses. Brother Anselm's drawn his inside a bread loaf, with little windows cut out. You suspect by the end of the week, someone will draw a full hedgehog cathedral. Maybe you. Out in the garden later, you find one of the younger novices watching the hedgerows. Looking for him, you ask. He nods. I think he's watching us back. You believe him. By now, the hedgehog is a celebrity, not just in the margins of your manuscript, but across the monastery. He or she has shown up in everything from the weekly schedule to the choir books. Last night, someone snuck a tiny hedgehog sketch into the center of the prior's sermon notes, right between a quote from St. Augustine and a reminder to fast next Tuesday. There he was curled up, reading a scroll with comically oversized glasses. The prior didn't say a word when he found it, just cleared his throat, adjusted his robe, and kept reading. But you saw the twitch of his lips, a private chuckle, carefully hidden. Monastic life was built on quiet rules, silent meals, measured steps, the firm schedule of hours. Yet here you are, in the middle of a miniature hedgehog revolution. And somehow, it fits. Because here's what no one tells you about monasteries, for all their solemnity. They're full of tiny, irreverent joys. A fig shared behind the kitchen, a wink over a mispronounced Latin verse, a hedgehog doodle hiding in a footnote. Historians still debate whether Marginalia was meant to be private fun, or if it held secret meanings, a kind of underground theology. One school insists it was pure amusement. Another believes these creatures represented emotional relief valves, safely tucked away from the scrutiny of the formal text. But no one can deny the presence of intent. You don't draw this many hedgehogs by accident. Today, you find yourself in the apothecary garden, sent to gather sage for the herbalist. You walk slowly between rows of thyme, lavender, and wormwood, careful not to disturb the bees. The scent of crushed mint clings to your sandals. And then movement. A rustle in the rosemary. You freeze. And there, nosing its way into the sunlight, is your muse. The hedgehog. Not a drawing. Not a joke. The actual creature. He blinks up at you, unimpressed. His tiny snout wrinkles. He seems to sigh. You nod solemnly. Good afternoon, Brother Hedgehog. He blinks again, then waddles past your foot like a dignitary on urgent business. You don't follow. That would be rude. Instead, you kneel beside the rosemary and imagine the little fellow going about his holy errands, collecting insects, judging your latest sketches, maybe preparing to star in someone's marginal tale about St. Lawrence and the miraculous roasting hedgehog. Because yes, there is one. You saw it yesterday. Someone, probably Brother Cedric, has drawn the hedgehog riding a spit beside Lawrence. The hedgehog holds a tiny fan, fanning the saint with grave concern. It's disturbingly wholesome. You rise, herbs in hand, and return to the scriptorium. But before you get there, you're waylaid by Brother Felix, the novice with a mop of wild hair and a constant look of surprise. He whispers, "They've started a bestiary." You blink. What? In the old storeroom. Back corner. Just come. So you do. The bestiary isn't sanctioned. It's a secret project, loose pages bound together with twine, passed from monk to monk like contraband. Each page is an entry, and each entry features, you guessed it, the hedgehog. Only this isn't a typical bestiary. This one's written as if the hedgehog were a holy creature, full of mythic powers and subtle sarcasm. You flip through the entries. The hedgehog is most sacred. When the world is too loud, it becomes the ball. When the truth is too sharp, it rolls beneath the brambles. It knows all but speaks little, and its silence is not surrender, but strategy. Another page has a hand-colored illustration of the hedgehog holding a candle in one paw and a small crossbow in the other. The caption reads, "The Guardian of the Margins." You laugh, not loudly, just enough for Brother Felix to grin. The entries are both absurd and strangely moving. You read one aloud. When the monastery is asleep, the hedgehog keeps vigil. He walks the cloisters unseen, chewing on beetles of temptation, and occasionally blessing the library. You wonder, for a moment, if these entries are really jokes, or if, in their own peculiar way, they're prayers. Mainstream theology wouldn't approve. Of course, there's no canonized Saint Hedgehog, no feast day for small mammals. But then again, faith isn't only found in sanctioned scrolls. Sometimes it shows up in a doodle, in the quiet reverence of shared humor, in the creature that survives because it knows how to hide. Back in your own manuscript, you add a new marginal note. It's not a drawing this time, just a phrase. And he saw that it was small, and therefore it was safe. You don't even know what it means yet, but it feels true. That night, while walking through the cloisters after Compline, you hear movement again. Not the hedgehog. Voices, low, murmuring. You turn a corner and find a small group of monks sitting in the chapel vestibule, passing the bestiary between them. They're adding entries by candlelight. One monk's sketching a hedgehog in bishop's mitre. Another's writing a hymn. You don't interrupt. You just sit down. And you realize something odd. No one planned this. No one said, let's turn the hedgehog into a symbol. It just happened. An organic theology. Born not of doctrine, but delight. The morning mist hangs low over the cloister garden, turning the familiar world into something hushed and dreamlike. You walk slowly, hood drawn over your head, half to keep warm and half to feel like a mysterious scholar in a forgotten legend. And let's be honest, you do look the part. A little ink on your sleeves, a little sleep in your eyes, and a whole universe of hedgehogs tucked into the margins of your mind. You pass the apothecary window and spot a row of drying herbs bundled neatly, smelling of lavender, sage, and something vaguely spicy that probably wards off demons or indigestion. You pause a moment, admiring the order of it. Then your eyes drift downward. Scratched lightly in the wood below the sill is a carving the familiar round shape of your prickly friend. Someone's etched a tiny hedgehog with wings, and beneath it, the words he ascended unto the compost heap. You snort. Holy hedgehog martyrdom. Historians still argue whether these kinds of irreverent expressions were tolerated or quietly punished. Monasteries weren't all strict conformity or all joyful rebellion. They wavered, day to day, depending on the prior's mood, or the weather, or which saints were trending. But you sense something shifting. The hedgehog is no longer just a recurring joke or an inky distraction. He's becoming a motif, not just in art, but in speech. Yesterday, Brother Anselm described his soup as about as complex as a hedgehog's theology, which you think was both a burn and a compliment. Even the cooks caught on. This morning's bread was shaped, well, let's just say deliberately spiky, and someone left a single sprig of rosemary tucked into its side like a quill. The whole monastery is in on it now. And that, more than any marginal drawing, proves that the hedgehog has gone viral 14th century style. You make your way to the library, where the bestiary has been smuggled into a real binding. Brother Felix managed to charm the cellarer into parting with some old parchment scraps, and now it has a cover worn leather, soft and warm, with a stitched emblem of a curled-up hedgehog in gold thread. You trace the outline with one finger. Inside, the entries have grown bolder, more surreal. One monk's written a psalm entirely from the hedgehog's perspective. Another has added a map of a fictional kingdom ruled by hedgehogs, complete with catapult towers made of chestnuts, and a university called Spina Magna. It's ridiculous. It's beautiful. It's exactly what this monastery needed. You sit beside the window, flipping through the pages slowly. The sun breaks through at last, a golden shaft lighting the scriptorium with almost divine focus, though. As always, it hits precisely the wrong spot and makes it impossible to see your own ink line. You move to the side. There's a new addition. You haven't seen it before. A full-page illustration of a hedgehog in a monk's robe, seated before a tiny lectern, quill in paw, looking solemnly at the viewer. The caption reads, "He writes not what is required, but what is needed." And that's when it clicks. This isn't just humor. It's therapy. The kind monks don't have a name for yet. the kind they don't know they need, because life here is structured but heavy, predictable, yes, but often lonely. You don't talk about doubt. You don't question the order of prayers. You don't always feel like a soul on fire for God. Sometimes you just feel tired, or hungry, or vaguely guilty for not feeling holier than you do. And into that space comes this tiny, awkward, resilient animal. Unapologetically itself, quiet, useful, weird, and somehow enough. You begin to wonder, maybe the hedgehog is the perfect monastic role model. He keeps his own counsel, lives humbly, hurts no one, rolls into a ball when things get too loud, doesn't ask for attention, but somehow gets it anyway. Historians point out that real bestiaries often moralized animals beyond recognition. The lion became Christ, the unicorn, virginity, the pelican, sacrifice, but the hedgehog refused to be categorized. Some early texts claim it symbolizes cleverness, since it supposedly rolls over fallen grapes to carry them home on its spines. Others say it represents gluttony because it eats too much fruit. Some suggest it's vigilance, but no one can agree. And maybe that's the point. The hedgehog remains its own strange little symbol. You can try to make it mean something, but in the end, it just is. And that, you think, might be the secret to peace in a monastery. You rise and stretch, bones popping in that satisfying way that says you're not young anymore, but you are alive. You walk down the hallway where the old paintings hang faded saints and forgotten benefactors. You spot something new, a small addition, just under the hem of St. Cuthbert's robe, a hedgehog, peeking out. You chuckle, and you keep walking. Later, just before Vespers, you find yourself alone in the chapel. The candles flicker, casting halos on the worn stone walls. Incense lingers, that familiar mix of myrrh and something like burnt honey. You kneel, not to pray for anything in particular, just to breathe, just to be, and in that quiet, you think of the hedgehog, curling up when it needs to, unfurling slowly, surviving in a world of eagles and plows and cold winter nights, a creature that thrives by being small, quiet, and unnoticed, but never unimportant. The wind outside is picking up now just enough to rattle the shutters. You hear the rustle of leaves, dry and feather-light, as if the trees themselves are whispering prayers through the night. Inside the scriptorium, the candlelight dances gently across the faces of your fellow monks, bent over their parchment with soft concentration. Tonight feels different, somehow, like the monastery is aware of its own stillness. You glance at your work in progress, an illuminated copy of a psalm. The gold leaf shimmers against the blue ink, the verse winding around the page like a river. And right there in the margin, just beneath the words, "My help cometh from the Lord," is your latest hedgehog. This one is sleeping, nose tucked to belly, surrounded by a halo of tiny stars. It's peaceful. You've stopped asking permission to draw them. No one minds anymore. In fact, some monks have begun to request a hedgehog blessing on their pages, especially for long or difficult passages. Brother Hugo claims it keeps the ink from blotting. Brother Julian swears his headaches have decreased. You suspect it's mostly placebo, but then again, maybe the placebo is the point. Historians still puzzle over the function of these marginal creatures. Were they mnemonic devices? Artistic filler? Secret satire? Theories abound, but certainty, as always, is elusive. You think of your own reasons, the little joys they've brought, the strange community they've fostered, the quiet reminder that holiness doesn't have to be stern to be sincere. Earlier today, during your garden shift, you watched a young novice carefully relocate a beetle off the path. He used a folded parchment, his daily readings, and murmured, "There you go, little hedgehog snack." You didn't correct him. It didn't seem wrong. Later, during midday meal, the prior stood and announced in his usual gravelly tone that a new rule was being added to the codex. No drawings of hedgehogs atop sacred relics. The room exploded in laughter. He did not laugh, but he also didn't take away your ink. You consider that progress. You remember one of the first drawings you ever saw the hedgehog riding backward on a snail, holding a banner. At the time, it felt like nonsense. Now, it feels like prophecy. Slow and small still gets there in the end. You return to your manuscript, brush a fleck of dust from the corner, and continue the illumination. Your brush moves slowly, deliberately, tracing lines that have been drawn for centuries before you and will be drawn centuries after. And you think how strange, how beautiful that you've added something of your own. Not in the main text. That belongs to the Psalms, but in the corners, the places where the mind wanders and the heart settles. You glance up and see Brother Felix watching you from across the room. He raises an eyebrow and gestures to his own parchment. You squint, then nod. He's drawn a hedgehog dressed as a pilgrim, staff in paw, making its way toward a stylized Jerusalem made entirely of turnips. You give him a thumbs up. He beams. The air smells of warm ink and old parchment, and beneath it all, the faintest trace of beeswax and lavender oil, used to polish the wood of the desks. You stretch your fingers, listen to the gentle creak of the timbers above, and think of how the world outside spins on, loud and chaotic. But here, in this room, the pace is slower, the noise is softer, the focus is narrower but deeper. A hedgehog in the margins might seem like a joke, a distraction, but you know better. You've seen what it does, how it weaves a thread of lightness through the heavy fabric of devotion, how it nudges the solemnity just enough to let the soul breathe. There's a theory half-whispered among your fellow scribes that one of the abbots from 2 generations ago left an entire manuscript filled with nothing but hedgehogs. No text, just drawings, 1 per page. Some say it was his penance. Others say it was his praise. The manuscript, if it exists, is long gone, but you like to believe it's out there, waiting in a dusty corner, a prickly gospel written in curls and ink blots. Tonight, after Compline, you linger. Most monks head straight to bed, but you find yourself drifting toward the west corridor, the one that leads to the archives. You slip through the heavy door, the iron latch clicking softly behind you. The air is thick with dust and secrets. Shelves rise around you, packed tight with forgotten knowledge sermons, herbals, census scrolls, even a play written entirely in Middle English and bad rhyme. You run your fingers along the spines, searching for nothing in particular. And then there, a small book, tucked sideways. You ease it out. The cover is plain. No title, no embellishment. But inside, hedgehogs, page after page. Some curled, some dancing, some crying, some laughing, a few sleeping beneath apple trees. No captions, no explanations, just hedgehogs. You sit on the cold stone floor and flip through slowly, awed by the dedication, the variety, the quiet humor of it all. It's like a prayer, not with words, but with presence. Whoever made this didn't do it for approval or reward. They did it because they needed to. And somehow, you understand that now. Maybe we all carry our devotions in different shapes. Some in chants, some in calligraphy, and some in a little ball of spines and tiny feet. You close the book gently, not because the story is over, but because you're ready to carry it with you. It's nearly midnight now, and the monastery hums in that soft silence you only get in places that are truly ancient. The kind of quiet that wraps itself around your ankles like fog and climbs gently up your spine, reminding you that you are part of something older than memory. You walk back to your chamber, book in hand, the one full of silent hedgehogs, their little forms curled and uncurling like punctuation marks in a prayer no one knows how to speak anymore. Your footsteps echo, but not sharply. The stone floors absorb most of the sound, like they've grown used to the rhythm of monastic life, the early rising, the pacing prayers, the slow, deliberate shuffle of a monk who's just remembered he forgot where he put his inkpot. Your room is small, a wooden bed, a plain desk, a shelf with 2 books and 3 rocks you swear are decorative, but which may also be just rocks. You set the hedgehog manuscript down carefully, like it might roll away if you don't. You light a single beeswax candle. Its flame is soft, gold-tinged, with a scent that reminds you vaguely of honey and something herbal thyme. Maybe, or one of those other plants Brother Conrad insists help with focus. though he also says that about beer. So, questionable source. You sit, you breathe, and you think about all the tiny rebellions that hedgehogs have inspired. A curled-up form in the margin of a sermon about eternal damnation. A spiny creature asleep beneath an angel. A hedgehog in a crown, perched on a throne of spoons. These were never part of the plan. No monk began his journey thinking, "One day, I shall devote my talents to the sacred depiction of an animal that looks like an animated hairbrush with a nervous system." But here you are, and maybe that's the lesson. Holiness doesn't always come in grand gestures or thunderous sermons. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the margins, in the curl of ink on parchment, in the warm laughter of brothers over dinner, in the moment you realize you've carried joy with you without even noticing. Historians still debate whether the hedgehog's rise in monastic art was intentional, whether it was protest, or parody, or accident. They can't quite agree. But here, inside this life, your life, it makes sense. The hedgehog is the embodiment of humility, armored, but gentle, solitary, but not unfriendly, present without demanding praise. You rise and move to the window. Outside, the moon hangs low and swollen, as if it too is sleepy from watching monks draw hedgehogs all day. The garden glows silver, each rosemary bush casting a long, wavering shadow. You can almost imagine one of those shadows twitching, sniffing the air, trundling across the cold stones. You smile. Somewhere, a rooster crows way too early. He always does this, possibly a personal failing, possibly just enthusiasm. Either way, someone will throw a shoe at him soon, and peace will return. You return to your bed. The candle flickers low. You blow it out. The room fades into darkness, but not emptiness. It's full of stories now. Ones you've read, ones you've drawn, ones you've carried, and as you lie back, wrapped in your rough woolen blanket that smells faintly of goat and good intentions, you hear it again, that faint scratching sound. Ink on parchment. Someone's still awake, still drawing, still adding one more hedgehog, because the work isn't really about hedgehogs. It's about connection, about making space, even in rigid silence, for something soft, something joyful, something real. So you close your eyes, and just before sleep takes you, you imagine the last page of that old manuscript, the one buried in the archives. Blank, waiting, because maybe the final hedgehog hasn't been drawn yet. Maybe it's yours to make, maybe it always has been. And now, as your breath slows and your thoughts begin to drift, let your mind soften its grip. There's no need to hold on to anything here. The monastery remains in gentle silence, the flicker of candlelight long since faded. You've walked its stone halls, heard its whispers, and smiled at its quiet rebellions. You've felt the weight of history pressing softly against your shoulder, not heavy, just steady, constant, like a friend. The hedgehogs you met tonight still curl in the corners of your imagination. They trundle through your dreams now, soft-footed and unbothered. They carry nothing on their backs but the smallest joys, a fallen fig, a curled leaf, a glint of mischief. They ask nothing of you. They offer only this, a reminder that joy doesn't have to shout. It can sit quietly beside you. It can grow in the margins. Feel the warmth of your blanket now, the rhythm of your breath. Let the quiet wrap around you like those medieval walls. Solid, timeless, safe. The world will still be there tomorrow. The loud parts, the serious parts. But for now, you're elsewhere. You're here, in a place where a monk once doodled a hedgehog, and in doing so, carved out a space for peace. Let the last image be a small one. A hedgehog, curled up beside a candle stub, sleeping, undisturbed. And now, so do you.